Characters of the Reformation, Part 8. Gustavus Adolphus. We saw in discussing the Emperor Ferdinand II that his failure was mainly due to the discovery of a great military genius by Richelieu, the hiring of that genius by Richelieu in the interests of France, and the launching of him also by Richelieu against the Catholic Emperor. The name of this genius was Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden. But for his quite exceptional talents in the art of war, Ferdinand would have succeeded in making all Germans united under the Catholic imperial crown, and in making Catholicism permanently dominating in Europe. The astonishing victories of Gustavus destroyed that opportunity, and Richelieu, his paymaster, was principally responsible. Gustavus Adolphus was the immediate descendant of the man who had ousted the rightful King of Sweden from his throne. The royal family of Sweden was called Vasa. The Reformation in Sweden had followed the usual lines. The great nobles or landowners of that small country had looted the lands and other wealth of the Church, just as they did in England. They had been supported, as in England, by a small but enthusiastic minority of religious revolutionaries, and they had precariously established a Protestant government. The whole thing was done with more difficulty than in England, because it came later. There were rich monastic establishments working almost to the end of the 16th century in Sweden, because, in spite of the one clique of men claiming to fill their own pockets, there was a succession of erratic monarchs whose individual eccentricity prevented a continuous policy, for there was something of madness in all the Vasa family. Now the legitimate heir to the kingdom of Sweden in the second generation of all this affair was strongly Catholic. And because he was hereditary king of Sweden, he was also the elected king of Poland, a country which, after much hesitation, had come down strongly on the Catholic side. This legitimate hereditary king of Sweden, Sigismund, thus became at one and the same time the king of Sweden and Poland. Even strong Protestants in Sweden hesitated to take the full step of rebellion and refused to accept his sovereignty, for that would have been shocking to the ideas of the time. But, being determined to keep their church loot, and at the same time to maintain independence of Sweden, so that her affairs should not be merged in those of Poland, they made the young king swear to respect all the institutions of Sweden and maintain the Reformation settlement of land in that country. Such a situation was too unstable to last. The vested interests created by the loot of the church in Sweden were, as in England, terrified lest a Catholic monarch should restore the church's wealth to its rightful owners, and they repudiated, in spite of their oaths, their legitimate king and adopted for their candidate to the throne his usurping uncle. When the usurping uncle, who thus held the throne of Sweden against all right, died, he left a young heir by the name Gustavus Adolphus, and that young heir was at once regarded by all those who had made their fortunes out of religious revolution as their champion. For they did not know, what was soon to be proved, that he was not only the leader of anti-Catholic influence in his little country, a community not much larger than Scotland then was, at the most 1.5 million souls, but a man unique in his time for the power of molding and using an armed force. Young Gustavus Adolphus began by making the wealthy men of his country impress, by forcible conscription, as a great a force as so small a community could yield. He then crossed the Baltic and launched out in adventures on German and Polish soil to the south of that sea. He was preoccupied in fighting his cousin, the Catholic King of Poland, upon whose throne he was himself an usurper, when his reputation reached the ears of the great French Prime Minister Richelieu. Richelieu had that quality which one continually finds throughout history in men who decide the course of international affairs successfully. He could foresee the results of character. It is true that Gustavus Adolphus had already given proofs of talent, but on a small scale and in a small field. Richelieu had gambled, if gambled be the right word, on the chance of Gustavus proving to be what, in fact, he did prove to be, a captain of the first rank. Richelieu sent an agent to approach Gustavus during his Polish War, to offer him money on a large scale if he would direct the attack on Ferdinand, who was in the midst of his hitherto successful experiment of recapturing Germany and establishing the power of the emperor over the cities and smaller states. The first offer Richelieu made to Gustavus was high, 3 big tubs of gold. Gustavus, who is always represented to us as the champion of ideal causes, held out for 5. Richelieu was determined to secure his services, and therefore agreed to the 5 tubs of gold. When this had been settled, and not before, Gustavus was ready to march. At first it looked as if the new situation would not make a very great change in the religious and political war among the Germans. Many of the German princes were jealous at seeing a Swede laying down a policy for them and enforcing it by his army. Some of them, though Protestant and northern, that is, far removed from Vienna, thought it was better policy to remain neutral. Moreover, they did not yet suspect, nor did Gustavus himself properly understand, what vast talent the Swedish king possessed in the trade of arms. This was soon to be manifest. The 30 Years' War between Ferdinand and the Protestants had been going on for more than 10 years. The critical point, at the moment when Gustavus Adolphus entered the struggle, was in the town of Magdeburg, of which I have just spoken. It was the lowest main crossing of the obstacle formed by the river Elbe, which prevented the emperor's armies working from the south to master the Baltic shore. Therefore, the imperial forces of Ferdinand were besieging Magdeburg. It will always be doubtful whether Gustavus Adolphus might or might not have relieved the town, and whether his failure to do so was due to personal prudence, that is, his conclusion that the risk of attempting it would be too great, or to the stubborn neutrality of the Protestant German princes who stood between him and the city. At any rate, he did not relieve it, and the rebel town upon which the eyes of all Protestant Europe had been attracted was stormed and sacked by the imperial General Tilly and his army. The most horrible barbarities were committed, and nearly the whole place was burned down. Though Tilly did his best to restrain the soldiery, he cannot be absolved from responsibility for the massacre which the rebels suffered. Gustavus Adolphus published an open defense of his failure to relieve the town, upon the value of which defense opinion is divided to this day. At any rate, shortly afterwards, the striking imperial successes had got him further Protestant alliances, and he began marching southward against the imperial armies, side by side with his Protestant German allies. It was at Breitenfeld, in the plain of North Leipzig, on the edge of the hills that bound this plain, that Europe woke up to the King of Sweden's genius. Then for the first time did Richelieu find himself amply justified in having hired him to reduce the power of the Habsburgs. Indeed, Richelieu found that he had purchased service too strong for him, and likely to embarrass his own plans. For Gustavus Adolphus, after his German Protestant ties had broken, restored the battle, and not only defeated the army of the Imperialists under Tilly, but virtually destroyed it. The remnant of the Imperialists fought magnificently for hours, but only a fraction could be led in formation off the field. All the baggage had gone, and all the artillery. It looked at that moment as though this battle would make all Germany Protestant. For exactly a year, Gustavus Adolphus now gathered to himself greater and greater forces from all the rebel and Protestant elements in the empire, and advanced southwards and westwards. He went to the Rhine. He held a sort of imperial court at Frankfurt. He very nearly did what Bismarck was to do more than 200 years later, convert the German Empire from a Catholic to a Protestant power. The great powers of Europe paid him court as though he were already in possession of imperial authority. All this in quite a few months after that tremendous victory near Leipzig. As may be imagined, Richelieu was frightened by the unexpectedly great success of his hireling. He did what he could to save the Catholic cause in Germany, and he got verbal promises from the victor, but he doubted their being kept. He was thoroughly alarmed at the too great measure of success he had obtained by his right judgment of the military talents of the Swede. Gustavus Adolphus, having thus made himself supreme upon the Rhine, and having swept over the whole of the north and center of Germany, proposed to turn upon the hereditary lands of Ferdinand II, and to strike at the heart of the old imperial power. There was a moment in which it looked as if he might have seized Vienna itself. He crossed the Danube. He invaded Bavaria. The great Tilly died of wounds received in action, and it seemed as though the Catholic and imperial cause were now really lost forever in the Germanies. At that moment, in desperation, Ferdinand called upon the captain who had formerly led the imperial troops to victory, Wallenstein. It was a risk, for the army would follow Wallenstein in person rather than the emperor, and no one knew what Wallenstein would do if he should prove successful again. He was quite unscrupulous and was playing his own hand. Armies in those days were nearly all mercenary. They followed a leader for pay, and the imperial government was poor. But Wallenstein, thus recalled, held a name which worked miracles among his soldiers. Ferdinand, then, took the risk, and Wallenstein marched against Gustavus Adolphus, whose center at the moment was Nordlingen, a nodal point in the communications between the Danube Valley and the north of Germany. Wallenstein refused to attack for a long time. He entrenched himself in the neighborhood of Nordlingen until at last he provoked the King of Sweden to attack him, almost exactly a year after the first spectacular victory of the Swedes at Breitenfeld. The shock came in 1632 on a day of fog and bewilderment. One may say that the Swedes had the best of it. Wallenstein lost his artillery and was tactically beaten, but there was no true decision, and the essential fact of the day was that Gustavus Adolphus happened to be killed in the turmoil. He probably fell through the accident of losing his way in the fog and getting surrounded by a detachment of enemies. At any rate, the death of the great Protestant hero shook the whole fabric of his enormous but ephemeral success. What followed was a series of ups and downs. The Swedish prestige could not be permanently maintained. The imperial forces recaptured a sufficient ascendancy to dominate, more or less, their opponents, but not to dominate them completely. The emperor, as we saw in the last chapter, was compelled, owing to the intrigues and surreptitious treasons of the time, to give up the essential of the whole affair, the restitution of church goods. Further, Ferdinand discovered that Wallenstein was likely to betray him, for the great but unscrupulous captain had all the strength now of an independent monarch, and Ferdinand was determined to reassert himself. His Spanish allies, that is, the other branch of the Habsburg house, furnished a new army, and the emperor behaved with the admirable courage and tenacity during the crisis in which the more than suspected treason of Wallenstein threatened his throne and his life. Ferdinand had the strength of will and the judgment to dismiss that too dangerous nominal subject who was really his rival. Wallenstein then betrayed the emperor and entered into communication with the Swedes, who were still the nucleus of the anti-imperial forces. But the emperor, in his moment, found men to serve him. Wallenstein was bearded in his quarters in the moment of his betrayal and was put to death by a group of officers in the imperial service. His second-in-command had already proclaimed his own loyalty to the emperor. With the death of Wallenstein, the emperor was free from his principal danger within, but lost his most talented commander. The struggle dragged on, lingering until after Ferdinand's death. The 30 Years' War did not end until the general pacification of the mid-century in the treaties which are usually known as the Peace of Westphalia. These were signed just before the triumph of the English Revolution against Charles I, and one may say that, after 1650, Europe was finally settled into the opposing cultures which it has since maintained. North Germany, thanks to the efforts of Gustavus Adolphus, and in spite of his death 18 years before, thanks to the statesmanship of Richelieu, the paymaster of Gustavus Adolphus, who was also by this time dead, was to be securely Protestant, and its princes and lords and cities to keep the loot of the religion. Catholicism in South Germany was saved, nominally, and the power of the emperor was still maintained. But it had failed to make a united country of its subjects. The great Swedish general had done his work well. Richelieu. The confirmation of Protestantism in Europe. Of all the public characters who molded Europe during the 17th century, Richelieu is both the greatest in himself and the most important in the effect he had. He perpetuated in France the presence of a Huguenot, that is, a Protestant, minority among the wealthier classes, and he confirmed the independence of Protestant Germany, initiating the breakdown of Catholic authority represented by the Emperor at Vienna. In other words, it was Richelieu's genius more than any other factor which led to the great battle ending in a draw, and to a Europe from one half of it in which the Catholic culture was to be permanently excluded. Most people would still say, being asked what was Richelieu's life work, the consolidation of the French nation through the strengthening of the French monarchy. That was certainly his intention. It was certainly the object to which he himself was devoted. Everything else he did was subsidiary to that in his own mind. But the fruits of a man's work are never those which he expects. There is always some side effect which will seem, after a certain lapse of time, to be the principal one. A man wins a battle in order to obtain a crown, and the result, unexpected by himself, is a change of language over a wide district. A man protects some oppressed people and liberates them from their oppressor, and the result, unexpected to himself and coming perhaps 100 years later, is the conquest of his own people by those whom he had befriended. A man raises a rebellion to establish democracy, and the result is government by a financial oligarchy. So it was with Richelieu. The one thing he cared about was giving the French people political unity, which could only be done by making the king strong. He succeeded, but the result was to leave the French morally divided between Catholicism and its enemies, while the much larger indirect result, which affected the whole world, was the creation of a firmly planted Protestant northern Germany, typified today by the power of Prussia, and all this power has meant during the last 150 years. The way Richelieu set about his task of strengthening the French people was as follows. He had noticed how, during his own youth, the great nobles, and especially the great Protestant nobles, were blackmailing and weakening the crown after the assassination of Henry IV. The worst culprit was old Sully, who went off with enormous loot as the fruit of threats to aid civil war against the Queen Regent. The king, the heir of Henry IV, was only a boy, under the title of Louis XIII. Until he should be of age, his mother, Marie de Medici, a violent but unpractical woman, was left in control. The result was that the rich could do pretty well what they liked. The Protestant nobles and the large Protestant middle class of the towns took full advantage of this position. It will be remembered that Henry IV, by the Edict of Nantes, had allowed them to hold a number of strong walled cities and govern them as a sort of state within the state, and had also permitted them to call national assemblies of their faction, which were a perpetual menace to the central power of the king. Richelieu saw that the first thing to be done if the crown was to be saved, its power increased and thereby the whole nation consolidated, was to take away these dangerous special favors and treat the Huguenots like everyone else. He was determined, when he came to power, that there should no longer be a realm within the realm, and a rival power strong enough to threaten the monarchy. But By so much as he was determined upon this, was he also determined upon the fullest toleration for Calvinism. Richelieu was the first of that long line of public men from his day to ours to treat religious difference as a private matter, and to believe that one can have a united country without unity of religion. James I of England, as we have seen, had some such idea at the back of his head, but he never really put it into practice, for the hatred and fear of the Catholic Church, of the great landowners, his subjects, whose fortunes had come from the loot of the Church, was too strong for him. And what is more, the great landowners proved in the long run too strong for the English crown, and destroyed it, substituting their own two assemblies, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, known as Parliament, for the old popular kingship of England. Richelieu saw the menace, though it had not fully developed in his own time, and he was determined that France should follow the opposite course. It is therefore due to him not only that France became politically united as a strong monarchy, but also that the peasantry won the long battle with the noble classes and became the main owners of the soil of France. Whereas in England the noble classes, that is, the squires, ate up the peasantry and became the main owner of the soil themselves. Richelieu's most famous exploit in this reduction of the political power of the French Huguenots was the siege and capture of their strong town, the port of La Rochelle. To satisfy Protestant feeling in England, the King of England, Charles I, had tried to succor the place by sending the Duke of Buckingham there with a fleet and an army. Buckingham very nearly succeeded, and would have quite succeeded, for he was an excellent soldier and laid his plans well, not attacking the town directly, which would have been a task beyond his powers, but threatening it in flank by seizing the great island at the mouth of the harbor. But having such an opponent as Richelieu to face, he lost. La Rochelle was captured by the King of France, and the Huguenot political privileges were at an end. All the more was Calvinism tolerated as a religion. In that very lifetime which saw priests butchered in England, after the cruel fashion for which the Puritans were openly responsible during their period of power, Calvinism in Catholic France was perfectly free. It had no martyrs and suffered no persecution. Although its followers were a minority among the French people, they were a considerable proportion of the wealthy class, and it was from them that the anti-Catholic feeling among the French gradually developed. Their influence did not take the form of converting any further numbers to Calvinism, but of familiarizing masses of Frenchmen with a dislike of the Catholic Church, so that at long last, after ferment had been at work for a couple of centuries, the whole nation was divided upon the issue, and remains violently so divided to this day. This religious division is the principal source of French weakness at the present time. While Richelieu thus, without intending to do so, sowed the seeds of religious division in France, he, also without intending to do so, sowed the seeds of that much graver growth, the religious division of Europe. We have seen, in what was said in the chapter concerning Gustavus Adolphus, how the center of Europe was being recaptured for the faith. The government of the British Isles was Protestant, and a determining majority of the population of Great Britain was Protestant. But Ireland was Catholic, and there was a large Catholic minority in England. In Holland, there was a Calvinist government. There was a still larger Catholic minority. It was only in Scandinavia that you had a Protestant population with no appreciable Catholic resistance remaining, and no one could guess as yet that one of these ill-populated countries, to wit Sweden, was going to produce a great military genius in Gustavus Adolphus. Long before Gustavus Adolphus appeared on the scene, Richelieu had watched with anxiety the increase of Catholicism in Germany and the recapture of district after district for the faith. And he had watched what seemed to us today so natural a matter for rejoicing in a Catholic statesman with anxiety, because he was thinking more of the power of his king than of the faith. To do him justice, he could not have conceived that Catholicism in Europe would ever be in serious danger. The Protestant nations were small and divided and hardly seemed to him a menace. England had, at the most, a third and probably not much more than a quarter of the population and wealth of France. Holland still less. The three Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, less even than Holland. For large as Sweden and Norway between them look on the map, much the most of their territory consists of uninhabitable mountains. Further in the Germanies, Protestantism was represented by a number of separate states and small principalities, jealous of each other and able to offer no permanent resistance to the advancing power of the Catholic Emperor, who ruled from Vienna and was determined to make all Germany a united nation under his own rule. But such a nation would have been a menace to France, and Richelieu set out to prevent such unity from being accomplished. Now that this military genius, Gustavus Adolphus, had appeared unexpectedly like a meteor in the international world, he realized the opportunity, and we saw in the last article how he hired Gustavus to be his soldier against Austria. Gustavus was defeated and killed in the very nick of time for Richelieu. A little more and he might have restored a united Germany of another sort. As it was, when he died he had saved Protestantism, but had not extended its boundaries. Richelieu, who had now become seriously alarmed at the unexpected magnitude of his prodigious success, felt free again. But even as it was, the challenge which he had thrown down to Austria was very nearly the ruin of his plans. The huge Spanish Empire was governed by another branch of the same family, and that which ruled the Catholic German Empire, the family who took their name from the castle of Habsburg. The Habsburg ruling in Spain was the cousin of the Habsburg ruling in Vienna. Part of the Spanish Empire in those days was the country now called Belgium. The Spaniards had a far greater money resources than the French in the early 17th century, and though the Spanish power was declining, no one suspected how far the decline had gone, for it was from within. The external appearance was still magnificent. They came very near to a decisive and crushing victory over the French, but they failed. Richelieu maintained French power victoriously unto his death, and the chief result of his policy was the falling in of Alsace under the French monarchy. The nobles in free cities in that holy German-speaking plain, lying between the Vosges and the Rhine, were divided, about one-third being for the Protestant cause and about two-thirds for the Catholic. But no one there wanted to be under the emperor, and one of Richelieu's Protestant allies, who was fighting the emperor, having been killed just after he had captured Brizac, the key fortress on which Alsace depended, his army was persuaded to solve its difficulties by offering the government of Alsace to the King of France. It was not a bad bargain for the Alsatians, all of whose local liberties remained, and who came nearer to enjoying self-government over the space of a century and a half than they were likely to come under either of the two rivals on the other side of the Rhine, the emperor or his Protestant opponents. Richelieu died in 1642, having seen all his schemes come to success. They came late. He could not be certain of his triumph until the very last years of his life. Even as his last sickness was upon him, when he was a dying man, it still looked as though the Spaniards in the south might be too strong for the French, although their attack from Belgium had been defeated. But by the actual moment of his death, Richelieu knew that he had conquered everywhere. What he did not know, but what the Pope of the day foresaw rather vaguely, was that the triumph of the French cardinal meant also the permanent establishment of Protestant power in Europe. Laud. Laud was the Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury under Charles I of England. He belonged to that generation which was born somewhat before the year 1600, and which was old by the middle of the 17th century, that is, by the time that each party in the great religious quarrel of the Reformation was dimly appreciating that the battle was a drawn one, and that there could not be a complete victory on either side. It will be remembered that the middle of the 17th century, and more particularly the date 1648, the treaties of Westphalia, marks that moment of exhaustion on the two sides. After it, what used to be the united Christendom was permanently divided into two camps of the Catholic and Protestant cultures, the boundaries of which have not appreciably changed from that day to this. Laud, as Archbishop of Canterbury, was the principal figure in English official Protestantism, that is, in the new establishment set up by William Cecil, known as the Church of England, in the critical period when the conflict was being decided. He was put to death by the English revolutionaries a little before the general settlement just mentioned, and he had begun his characteristic activities less than 20 years after the beginning of the century. His personality is most interesting. He was of the middle ranks of society, with no special advantages of birth, and gained public attention wholly through his own energy and character. That energy was intense and never failed him to the end. It was as great in his last days as in his first, and it animated a very small body, for he was almost a dwarf in size. His volume of work and correspondence was enormous. His power of attention to detail was equally great, and he followed a fixed, clear policy with great chances of success, which was only defeated by the rise of a general rebellion against the English royal government, which his own activities in office were included. The importance of Laud in any study of the great religious quarrel and its unsatisfactory drawn settlement in the 17th century is considerable, and it lies in this. He was an early example of how the great Catholic recovery, which had marked the end of the 16th century, reacted upon the Protestant world. But at the same time, Laud is a still more striking example of the way in which the Reformation had made the Protestant attitude of mind unescapable for those who had broken away from the Catholic unity. In other words, the interest of his career lies in this, that in spite of certain sympathies with Catholic tradition, and in spite of their recovering certain sides of the general European culture, the Protestants throughout Europe, and even in England, where Catholicism was still strong, were condemned to be the victims of the original violent rebellion which had taken place in their fathers' time. In the case of Laud, and of England in general, this was particularly striking because the force which made against their returning to Catholic unity was the force of nationalism. That is, the claim of lay society and its prince, or king, to independence from the general moral unity of Christendom and the West. All of this is summed up, of course, in the refusal to accept papal supremacy. Laud was the chief and leader of those who had come to deplore the losses inflicted by the Reformation, and the wounds which it had inflicted upon normal human habit. He was the leader and representative of those who feared and disliked Puritanism as a moral disease. He had sympathy with the natural and excellent use of images in worship. One of the counts in the indictment against him, on which he was put to death, was his having put up a statue of Our Lady and the Holy Child, which one may still see standing above the main door of the University Church of Oxford, St. Mary's. He and those like him, who were now becoming numerous in the English established Protestant Church, not only felt a sentimental attraction towards the lovely and human externals of Catholic worship, but were also inclined, one cannot use a stronger word, but at any rate inclined, to consider the fullness of the Catholic doctrine in nearly all points. They inclined, as their descendants, the High Churchmen, do today, to an explanation of the mystery of the Eucharist more and more approximating to the truth. They inclined to sacramental penance and the sacramental view of religion in general. They were particularly strong upon the necessity of a hierarchy and upon what they hoped was in their own case, and what they admitted in the case of Catholics to be, the apostolic succession. They desired to regard their clergy as priests, and some of them indeed would come even to say sacrificing priests. But with all this, they remained Protestant. They remained, though they would not have admitted it, thoroughly anti-Catholic, because they rejected that one part of Catholic doctrine which is essential, the combination of unity and authority. The unity of the visible church and its invincible authority were repugnant to their growing nationalism, and those who preserved such an attitude of mind were just as much the enemies of Catholicism as the most rabid Puritan could be, or the most complete agnostic. Laud himself used a phrase which has become famous in this regard. He said that he could not consider reunion with Rome as she now is. Now that phrase was not only a rejection of unity, but by its wording it implied that there was no united visible church on earth. The use of the word Rome in this connection emphasized and was intended to emphasize the doctrine that the Church of Rome hath erred, which inevitably includes the doctrine that all the churches, as the phrase go, has erred, and therefore there was no united, visible, infallible church. There is to be remarked, embarrassing Laud and his followers in the early stage of the great quarrel, just the same difficulty which embarrass high churchmen or so-called Anglo-Catholics today. It is impossible for them to give a clear definition of their position, because they, while abhorring the word Protestant, are essentially Protestant in refusing unity and in preferring a national religion, which can include any degree of heresy, to an international religion which excludes all heresy. If you were to have asked Laud what doctrines he taught, he would have replied with some, though insufficient, definition. If you had gone on to ask him, do you separate yourself from those within your national church who deny these doctrines? Do you cut them off from their communion? He would have either answered no or to remain silent. To those Protestants of his own day who were violent against other Catholic doctrines besides that of unity, who hated the doctrine of the real presence, who detested any sacramental system, who were excited to anger at the idea of a priesthood, in other words the Puritans, Laud and those who thought with him seemed to be half Catholic. They seemed to be leading England back to Catholicism. They were even spoken of as papists by the more extreme of their opponents. But all that was false and an illusion. In certain externals they proposed to imitate or recover certain Catholic practices, and they did cherish an affection for much of the Catholic spirit. But that which is the very heart of the whole matter, ut sint unum, they reject. Nor did they reject it with reluctance. Their rejection of it was fundamental to their whole position. It was a position expressed in many phrases, all of which strongly illuminate its character. Thus there is the phrase which speaks of the Church of England as the Church of our baptism. There is the phrase which calls the Pope an Italian priest. We were implored only the other day by a high dignitary of the Church of England not to grovel at the feet of an Italian priest. Just as the rejection of unity coupled with infallible authority is the intellectual and doctrinal test of Laud's Protestantism, so in that equally important matter of the emotions and affections is repugnance for the true Church in communion with the Pope as the center of unity, the test of his Protestantism also. The Catholic Church of its nature excites either great loyalty or repulsion. When it excites repulsion in a man, that man is the enemy of the faith, even though he accept the greater part of its doctrine and the greater part of its traditional externals, and an organization and discipline under a hierarchy similar in name to the Catholic. Now for the Catholic Church, Laud and his followers felt repulsion instead of affection. They felt, to use a modern phrase, that it was un-English. In other words, their religion must be national, and the fact that a true and universal religion must necessarily be international was to them a strong irritant. It is this which explains the deep and permanent sympathy which had existed between Laud and his king, Charles I, who had made him archbishop. Charles had not the same sentiment of sympathy with many Catholic externals that Laud had. He was by temperament what you would call today evangelical. An experience of his early youth, his voyage to Spain and the failure of his royal marriage there, had emphasized his strong dislike of Catholicism. He sincerely believed that the Church of England, as he had known it with its ceremonies and ministers in his boyhood, was the most perfect Christian organization, and therefore his attitude implied that there could be many such organizations side by side, many churches, and no one infallible authoritative church. Charles disliked the Mass in spite of his increasing affection for his Catholic wife, the sister of the King of France. He disliked the Catholic priesthood and their whole spirit. He had nothing about him of what we call today the High Anglican. Yet he got on capitally with Laud, and Laud with him, the reason being that the real devotion of each was towards the royal and national power, the complete independence of the English realm and the English king from all other authority, spiritual or temporal. An effort at unity which Laud made had little to do with spiritual unity, even within his own communion. He was there concerned with unity of practice, with imposing a similar liturgy upon England, Scotland, and Ireland. For the sake of dignity and for the sake of historical tradition, Laud would see to it that the liturgy was interpreted in terms of considerable pomp and careful ritual, but did not impose dogma. He was determined that the English communion should be the only communion service where the King of England ruled, and that it should be given at the altar rails and not haphazard at a table in the middle of the church, that the elements should be received kneeling, and so forth. But he was content to leave aside the essential definition of what the real presence was, whether or no Jesus Christ appeared on the altar at the consecrating words of a priest. These, which are to the Catholic mind the essentials, seemed to him things no doubt important, but not essential. The essential was the unity of the Church of England, and its independence from the general Christendom of Europe. Activities of Laud's life and the manner of his death have between them made him of considerable effect upon the subsequent history of the Anglican Church. His activities were political, strongly supporting the monarchical government, which was then the traditional government of England, personal government by a king responsible to the nation, the centering of power in an individual whose duty it should be to defend the weak against the strong and prevent the wealthier classes from lording it over their fellows. On account of this political activity, Laud was swept into the great revolutionary battle of his time. The interests of the wealthy, the merchants and money dealers in the city of London, the interest of the squires and the great landowners, all these made for rebellion against the power of a personal king. In the movement was hardly conscience. Many hesitated to join the rebellion. Very many went against their own class interest and defended the monarchy when it came to the actual issue of arms. Nevertheless, what are called the English Civil Wars were essentially a struggle between wealth and the crown. Early in that struggle, the interests of wealth allied themselves to, and were mixed with, the violent religious passions of Puritanism. A very large proportion of landowners and far larger proportion of the great merchants were Puritan. Therefore, as the struggle increased in violence, Laud became the target of a double attack. He had repressed Puritanism in religion. He had supported personal monarchy in politics. His person was seized by the rebels. He was imprisoned, and at last they put him to death. Such a career and such a termination to it created what may be called the legacy of Laud. Politically, that legacy came to nothing. The victory of the wealthier classes in England was so complete and the corresponding defeat of the monarchy so thorough that the very idea of government by a king died out in about half a century after Laud's death. One long lifetime after his beheading on Tower Hill, the English throne was filled by a puppet monarch who was not even allowed to attend the governing council of the realm. From that day onwards, England had been governed by the great landowners and by the money dealers in the city of London. But the legacy of Laud in ecclesiastical matters had more vitality. It fell very low during the 18th century, but it was revived before the end of that century when a sermon, famous in its time, was preached from the pulpit of the University Church at Oxford in favor of sacramental absolution and the revival of the sacrament of penance in the Church of England. There followed, in the same lifetime, the Tractarian movement, and there now exists in greater force than has hitherto been known a Laudian spirit acting in varying degrees throughout one great section of the English Protestant establishment. The more devoted followers of that spirit go far beyond Laud himself in their imitation of Catholicism, even in the attempt to recover the spirit of that which they are separated. A considerable minority expressed themselves openly in favor of that reunion with the Catholic Church which Laud himself rejected. Such is the legacy of Laud. We must beware of being led by its present form from reading into his own life more than that life meant. He was in his own time distinctly and clearly anti-Catholic, wholly devoted to a separate English church of which the special mark was refusal of communion with the Catholic Church as a whole and rejection of its authority. But he does show how the recovery of Catholicism after the first assaults of religious revolution affected one section of Protestantism in Europe. As against this, within the same Protestant society was organized the Calvinistic spirit, manifested as Puritanism. By an accident of war, the man who became the most prominent in that connection was Oliver Cromwell.